Well, again, this is Pastor Steve Dammer for A Moment in Ministry, and we're using the similar format of a discussion panel with Dr. Jeff Oglin, Pastor Dan Armacost, and so we're going to talk about theology and freedom. Do they mix? Do they intertwine? We think they do. There's some of you out in La La Land, all right, social media land, that don't agree, but that's great. Because I guess that's why you claim Baptist, so that you could have individual soul liberty.
Right.
The only reason. All right, so I'm going to have Pastor Armacost, who does a lot of our Baptist history, and he's going to delve into some Baptist history with our commentary once in a while.
So the period of American history transitioning from the colonial period to the United States of America,
Oh, yeah.
I think is the critical time to see men that were born and raised at a certain point in their life under the rule of England and all the laws that then
Right.
filtered over to the colonies,
Right.
and how that changed to the place where there was a break from not just England as far as government's concerned, but also with regard to
Church
our
of England.
Constitution, the church,
Right.
yes, the state church idea. So, to me, that's the best time in history to look at what it took, for these men to make that, to facilitate that transition to take place, the cost that it took, and the mindset that they had when they looked at Scripture under a state-controlled church and what they envisioned the Bible represented.
All right, so I'm going to jump in because I've been reading on that too. So they call that the Sacra Society. Is that the idea?
The Sacro Society.
Sacro
yes.
Society, which what was interesting to me, which we have talked about, I think it's a problem with a Reformed theology coming back into Baptists. All right, so it's a Reformed idea.
Sure.
They go to Israel, and they're saying, we have to be just like Israel. So that means that there's a state and church
Unity.
unified.
Right.
And so I was reading on that, and I was like, oh, that's and it's coming back in today's day.
Yeah,
age.
so Sacred Society, the church would be the place where your birth was recorded at the time of your infant baptism, infant sprinkling,
Yeah.
and then your marriage would be performed there. And so then the sacraments, not a Bible term,
Yeah.
the sacraments would be performed there. And so if you stepped away from that, you were, I think the Latin word is persona non grata, if you wanted to be separate from the Sacral Society or be a part of the Church of England. So, of course, there were men in England, nonconformists, that, depending on who the monarch was, had some semblance of some freedom in England in the time prior to the Revolution. For instance, John Bunyan, he was a nonconformist and a Baptist. Depending on who the monarch was and what the whim of the monarch was, there were certain times he had some freedom to go out and preach, but then very quickly a monarch could make a law that just forbid anybody from preaching, in essence, unless you're a part of the state church. And so one man that I think is a case study during the transition from colonial America to the United States of America is James Manning. And so he was the president of what is now Brown University.
Okay.
He became president there in 1765 at the age of 27 years old. And he was a pastor as well in Rhode Island. And so when Brown University first started, he ran the school out of his parsonage and out of the church house, Baptist church house there. So it eventually Brown moved to Providence. So in 1774, Manning is 36 years old. And there is a lot of very intense discussions, debates that are going on about the potential for separation from England, what that's going to involve, and at the same time, what the new nation would look like if there was a separation from it. And so it was a time for the best and the brightest arguments to come out and be made. And Manning, at the age of 36, he is presented one of the most notable arguments in Philadelphia to leading men from Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. And to summarize what he said, part of his quote is this: "It has been said by a celebrated writer in politics that but two things are worth contending for: religion and liberty. For the latter, or liberty, we are at present nobly exerting ourselves through all this extensive continent. And surely no one whose bosom feels the patriotic glow in behalf of this civil liberty," which he said they were fighting for, "can remain torpid," there's a big word that means lethargic, "can remain lethargic to the more ennobling flame of religious freedom." So he said, we're in this battle for civil liberty, and that's great. But he said, how can we be lethargic to something that's even more important for our churches, our families, our futures, our worship of God, which is religious freedom. And so he saw that civil liberty is important, but it is superseded by this wonderful opportunity for religious freedom, so that he did not have to answer to a state church. He did not have to be told by law where his kids were going to be baptized at and how they were going to be baptized.
Yeah.
And so we are reaping from Manning and others like him that assisted with the cause of the American Revolution to bring about their goal, and their foresight was a place of religious freedom. We reap from that. So we have to ask ourselves, is there do we have some type of responsibility for the benefits that we've been reaping from all of it? Do we have a responsibility or not?
So that'll jump into what we were talking about. So why don't you jump into your proposed question? To me, it goes along with that.
Okay,
So kind of.
I have a thought while he was saying this.
Right.
I think which will bring us to that. What Manning, if I hear him right, understood is that Jesus Christ is Lord over everything. He's Lord over civil liberty and religious liberty. He's Lord over what we do at the state house and what we do at the church house. Now, there's a standpoint that would say, well, if he's Lord over everything, then the church should be over the state.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
But
and
Baptist,
right.
And there's a lot of that.
There's
thought.
a lot of that thought.
But America, and it was Baptist, understood that there should be. They didn't use this term necessary, a separation of church and state. And I think that Americans now, 240 years later, have said that our whole lives, that we can compartmentalize our lives between a separation of church and state.
Yeah.
But just because the state can't meddle in the church, and the church really shouldn't meddle in the state, doesn't mean that God has nothing to. Does God care what a nation does?
Right.
Well, obviously He does. Anybody. But if you're of the opinion that as pastors we really don't need to concern ourselves with what the government says.
Right.
Then we're saying, well, God doesn't concern himself with what governments do. And the Bible is clear that God does. I mean, it says, righteousness exalteth a nation.
Yep.
How do you have a righteous nation unless you have righteous people in it? And a pastor might say, well, then just go out and win souls. But you have to teach those souls, and some souls won't get it.
Yep.
They won't get saved, but will understand how a nation acts righteously. Just so many of the things that are encoded in our Constitution and our original laws are righteous laws. They're things that we got from the Bible. So righteousness exalts a nation. And I guess does God? Yes, He cares. I mean, He judges nations, not just when God sent the Chaldeans against Israel, against Judea, there was godly people in Jerusalem that were killed and that were taken into captivity, but God still sent that as a judgment on because he was judging the nation of Judea. I mean, Daniel was a righteous man. Daniel was a godly man, but he got taken into captivity. Yeah. So there's good people suffer when a nation gets punished. God doesn't just deal with people. And that's one of the things that our founding fathers and influenced by pastors, Baptist pastors, and perhaps even others, understood that God deals with people, but God deals with nations. And I think we have forgotten this. We've become so independent, so individualized that, like, well, just preach the Bible or just do this. But God is concerned with me, but he's concerned with my family. He's concerned with my church. He's concerned with my community.
Yeah.
And he will use evil to accomplish his will. He will punish the evil then too. I mean, he punished the Chaldeans for doing more than what he wanted them to do against Israel. Amos tells us that. But so...
Well, and also going along with that, let's continue that thought. And also, I remember us talking, and this was years ago. I asked you to study it out and present it to our church about what about Christians' role, and as we went through Scripture,
a Christian's role in government,
all over the place. You could go back.
David was a ruler.
Joseph
was a ruler. Daniel was a ruler. Solomon was. How many people who wrote books of the Bible were actually in government, at high levels of government?
And yet, you can't. You're not supposed to have anything. So it's,
and we look up to them because they were righteous men. Doing what they should have done, and they were doing what God wanted them to do in government. So, God, there is a church and state. Their roles don't really overlap, but me, I'm an individual. I can have an influence in my church. God expects me to have an influence in my church, and he expects me to have an influence in as a civilian, as a person in the state. He expects that because he's Lord over all of it. And he expects me to take my Bible with me in a figurative way into the ballot box, into the public square. My Bible doesn't have to stay in the pulpit or in my devotional booth. I take it in the public square and say, this is wrong. This is what's going on here today in our state is wrong according to the Bible. And if you don't think the Bible talks about that, then you think God doesn't care about, God doesn't put a blind eye toward anything in our lives. We rightly so, because our lives are spiritual and this world will be left behind. We prioritize the spiritual. But God cares. You look at the Old Testament law. He cares whether I wash myself before I go to bed at night. And, what...
pretty specific.
He's very specific about things that have what we would say is nothing to do with going to heaven or not. He cares about the mundane also.
So I do think back to Manning and his group that the war was won against England, but now becomes a war, a battle of ideas for what this nation is going to be constituted
what it's
as.
going to look like, yes.
And so when it came time for the Constitution to be ratified, Massachusetts, it was up in the air whether or not they were going to sign on to it. And they were key because they were a big state. Massachusetts and Virginia were key. Virginia, definitely champions of religious liberty. Massachusetts, not so much. John Adams, he liked that state church idea. And it was going to be very difficult. And so I find it very interesting that that Manning and Samuel Stillman and Isaac Backus, now there are three Baptists, got sent down to plead their case with the Massachusetts Assembly prior to their vote on whether or not to ratify the Constitution. And that was presided over by John Hancock. And prior to the vote, he asked James Manning to pray. And Hancock didn't make a claim of being a born-again believer, as we would say, as far as Scripture would go. However, in the end, It was a close vote, 187 to 168, in favor of a constitution or a nation constituted with religious freedom, not religious toleration.
Right.
And they
Right.
knew the difference between those two.
Yeah.
And even that constitution allowed every state was a sovereign state that was together in that. And I would dare say that the Massachusetts Constitution at that time did not allow for freedom of religion.
Right. That's right.
It didn't have a First Amendment to it.
That's right.
Our First Amendment that we claim talks about the national government
Yes.
in prohibiting or inhibiting or
Yeah.
being a block, a
yeah,
restraint
restriction.
on freedom of religion. States maintained that authority to have freedom of religion or not.
You're right. It was in the
So to have
1800s before
that
got
kind of
passed in
trickled down
Massachusetts.
from,
Yeah.
but to have Massachusetts, who had a state church, ratify a federal constitution that allowed no state church by the influence of Baptists is
Providential.
yes.
I would say.